Hello, konnichiwa, and welcome to this week's first actual Dev Diary video. Today we are going to be talking about historical Japan.
What do you mean first? There was a doctrinary work Dev Diary last week.
Shut up, you. Today is going to be such a tremendously large Dev Diary, I can't spend too much time on preamble, and instead will mostly be narrating images with information as we look at the historical Japanese focus tree. So, without further ado, let's begin. We start this overview with an interesting image showing off a classical Japanese castle complex. I'm unsure as to which castle this is depicting. Edo, Nijo, Kyoto, maybe Osaka, I'm unsure. What does strike me is some of the detail juxtaposed between the castle and the housing models versus the 2D rails and river graphics mixed with that interesting height map with the texture plastered across it. Speaking vaguely, it would be interesting to imagine what a future map could look like in a hypothetical Hoi 5 if they took a page out of CK Free's recent map design. But no, let's focus on No Compromise, No Surrender. So, for a historical recap, as you can see on screen, there is a tremendous amount of background info discussing the historical situation of Japan leading to January 1936. The TLDR is Japan felt slighted by the post-war settlements of World War I despite being on the Allied winning side. That, and a lack of domestic resources, led to a rise in militarism to seek recourse for the last Great War and to embark on some empire building in Manchuria. The last note is this was spearheaded by the army and navy over the civilian government, who will all play their part in the upcoming faction rework. With that being said, this is our starting situation in Japan. Some familiar spirits I can see here, with some new and certainly noticeably a new starting leader. Hirohito is missing. Japan will start off as non-aligned going forward. Previously, they started off as fash, to reflect how their flagging democratic government was pulled towards authoritarianism. So it was democratic, but they're reflecting it as non-aligned, and it's moving towards fash. Our starting leader then has reduced ideology drift defense, but more so, let's look at that create faction button. The starting sphere is gone, and instead an individual faction founding mechanic. Previously, factions were basically entirely handled inside the diplomatic menu with other countries, meaning you needed another nation to accept to create your faction before you could even found one. With this screen, I wonder if it means you are allowed to create a faction by yourself, with you, yourself, and I. Next up, let's blast through some spirit analysis. The Imperial Army has been split into an armour doctrine and generic section to highlight the lack of advancement in Japanese tanks compared to their Western counterparts. Additionally, the hyper-aggressive warfare of Japan gives bonuses to initiative and recovery rate, but loses out on defense, and most importantly, supply. Minus 20 supply efficiency. Hopefully that doesn't hit you too hard. Heading into the core of China is definitely already a slog of the ages, but to get debuffs on top as well as having the Yangtze flooded behind you? That might be bad news bears. The Imperial Navy is the next spirit, focusing on the Great Fleet Battle, or Kantai Kesen. The goal is to win one large conflict, and not a series of protracted smaller ones, with buffs to ship in first contact and aggression, but lacking in counter-submarine warfare. Perhaps you as Japan should find a way to counter those submarines, or stick all your eggs in one basket and try to really make that system work. The Air Services spirit is notable for its split between the Army and Navy having separate air forces. This is a similarity, I feel, to the United States in a sense. The training was rigorous, but very slow, and the debuffs reflect that, with the presumabilities to mitigate and improve. The training was rigorous, but slow, and the debuffs reflect that, with the presumable abilities to mitigate and improve it. The industry has also seen better days, with flat debuffs all across the board for its national spirit. Due to the lack of natural resources, the hyper-dominant market of the 1990s Japan has yet to materialise, and instead you're playing catch-up, albeit surprisingly well, to get on par with Western powers. As seen here with minus 3% research speed and some lack of resources penalty, the main spanner in the works is going to be removing that consumer goods factories factor. And lastly, we are shown one heifer of a national spirit with imperial influence, designed to reflect the internal factions biting at each other for control of the national agenda. The army, the navy, the Zaibatsu industrial powers, and the civic faction. For those who have played Bulgaria or Greece, you may be familiar with similar faction mechanics within your country. However, in this instance, they are all collected into a series of modifiable buffs and debuffs within the single Imperial Influence spirit. This means you can swap in and out subsections depending on how your faction's narrative develops. This is something you might also have noticed with the Army Spirit and the Air Spirit. So, why don't we take a look at some of these factions? All in all, it seems to be a majority of mostly debuffs that you're going to be working with. However, as is the case with mages, they have some pretty strong potential to grow, so I wouldn't see this as a major obstacle just yet. At any rate, let's go take a closer look at some of these factions. Introducing Imperial Influence, the alternative to Balance of Power that turns a sliding scale into a leaderboard of factions. All headed by Hirohito. As we saw with the National Spirit, having the factions work for you is far better than them providing debuffs, and so using this GUI, you'll be able to endorse or suppress the 4 towards your goals. We see in the image that they've arranged it so from best to worst we have 4 types of faction states you can have: dominating, influential, meddling, and subdued. Note you can only have 1 dominating faction and only 2 influential, so you will have to pick 1 faction at least to be your dunce target. Not everyone can be your friend. I don't really have too much to comment on choosing this over Balance of Power, because the presentation parity doesn't weigh as heavily to me over what really matters, how fun a mechanic it is to interact with. But since we haven't played with it yet, that remains to be seen. Our next image provides examples of what it's like if you were to have any of the 4 factions as dominating factions. The army would create cheap equipment and fuel, the navy cheap ships and fuel, the Zaibatsu making civ greed a very attractive proposition, and the civic faction acting as a peaceful accord. At a glance, I think I would want to keep the army and the navy high, while banking on the early game Zaibatsus to build me some massive civilian factory base, while probably leaving the civic faction by the wayside. I'm not sure the political power can really justify a minus 25% war support debuff. That being said, these faction states do influence more than just their spirit. Seen here, taking focuses will also have the option to change faction influence. The focus preparing the northern front increases the influence of the army from meddling to influential, with all the bonuses we saw from earlier too, as the army and navy were historically bitterly hostile towards each other. Any rise in the army leads to a fall in the navy power through inter-service rivalry. Considering this, it might be a little bit more difficult than I previously wanted to have both the army and the navy be influential. It seems when one goes up, the other goes down. Not too surprisingly, some focus will only be unlockable if you have a certain faction with high or low influence respectively, so managing factions will be connected to progressing your focus tree and not just receiving buffs or debuffs with the national spirit. Shown in the most obvious way, to expand the proving grounds, you would want the army faction to be influential since it's an army based focus, and to change your naval approach, it would make sense that the naval faction hasn't been completely subdued. Because we need these factions in order to take focuses, you don't just have to rely on the focuses to change their position, you can also manually spend 100 political power to endorse or suppress a faction moving up or down the influence ladder. Notice how one of the requirements talks about Hirohito interfering in imperial faction matters. It seems that it's possible for the will of the emperor to take some root in Japan. The final thing we learn about factions is that if one of your factions becomes too powerful, that can result in them demanding you, the player, to fulfill one of their goals. In this case, a series of timed missions will arrive for you to complete, lest the faction lose influence and its buffs. The civic faction, here for example, wants the trade law to be set to free trade or export focus, which is interesting that they didn't hear about the resource shortage situation we're facing. Someone should probably tell them that we're trying to fuel a war machine, and also the buffs they give you are terrible. Maybe I will fail this mission. Right then, I think it's time we stop the yap on factions and start talking about what we're really here to see, the focus tree, and we will be beginning with the mechanized elephant in the room, the industry. Finally getting a good look, we can see that beginning with the Ministry of Commerce and Industry, we split between two sections, the kind of foreign international development and the internal homeland development, although I suppose you're trying to make the international become the national. Some of those empire building focuses include the Manchurian Industrial 5-year plan, giving Manchukuo some buffs, but perhaps if you're playing as them, you could benefit from some of these buffs, which was the case in the previous Japanese focus tree. The Eastern Road and Steel expansion, again, Manchukuo getting some buffs with some smaller resource buffs for yourself. Expanding the Oriental Development Company, which is a simple bonus towards a industrial company. And prepare for the Peninsular War, to ensure that Korea should be able to deal with some of the conflict that may be heading its way. But you would be hoping that it doesn't come to that, because if there's conflict in Korea, you might be about to lose the Second Sino-Japanese War. Across the board here, nothing too dramatic to talk about, although having 1% non-core manpower is pretty useful combined with some of the other buffs. Moving on to the right side, the Homeland Territory begins with a mutually exclusive choice between continuing Takahashi's policies or increasing armament spending. This is, of course, one of the more simpler choices. Do you want an early game civ build, or are you speedrunning straight towards military factories? From initial reaction, I do feel like continuing Takahashi policies is probably the better one, with its consumer goods factory factor reduction compared to an increase. But remember, the civic faction cannot be subdued, otherwise it's just not possible. Moving on, you'll have to pick between 4 of the major conglomerates Mitsui, Mitsubishi, Sumitomo and Yasuda, each of them providing a pretty significant amount of text to take into account. So in the case of Mitsui, we gain 2 civs, research bonus for production, factory output, kind of good buffs all across the board, nothing too negative to see here. Mitsubishi seems to be a slightly more military focused one, with funds going towards some of the designers that you can use, only 1 civ, and research bonus for ships. Additionally, you do unlock a political advisor in the form of Iwasaki, so if you're looking for a conglomerate but military focused campaign, Mitsubishi might be your choice. Sumitomo comes in next with only 1 civ, but a focus on excavation and resource gathering, with its resource gain efficiency, excavation technology bonuses, and a mining and machinery zaibatsu. So yeah, basically resources. And lastly we have Yasuda, construction technology, so kind of just about building up the nation, consumer goods factory factor, and massive reduction for the industrial concern. Oof. Of course, consumer goods factories factor isn't what it used to be. Additionally, you might note that taking guide the zaibatsu or work with the zaibatsu can actually reduce the time it takes for this focus to complete. I know a lot of people have some concerns that the game can kind of feel a slog when all the focuses are 70 days. So this is kind of interesting, that the length of the focuses can be changing depending on your political situation. Continuing to build up the nation, you may want to establish at least 35 civilian factories, maybe that's kind of like the early game build-up goal, so that you can unlock 1 research slot, and if the zaibatsu are at least influential, 1 nuclear research facility. Considering all the research buffs in here, I think there's a pretty good argument to go for this relatively early on. Beyond the Riken Institute, we can find some more focuses that are kind of a mystery. The dam, we can hope, introduces the dam mechanic that you can build on the map, giving you building slots and some other buffs, I think. The bullet train plan is very interesting. I hope it provides more than just building a railway across the country, although I assume it will also do that. And finally at the bottom, resource security, which we do get to know about. If the goal of Japan's expansion was to ensure resource security, then this focus is no joke, because it requires you to even take it. 200 steel, 200 aluminium, 200 oil, 200 tungsten, 150 chromium, 800 rubber, and, the new resource we now know about, 200 coal. This may come across as familiar to some of you who have played with Germany and tried to go for their Mephobil's rapid expansion kind of industry tree, which also ends in trying to get enough resources to be able to cancel out the massively stacking Mepho mechanic. Luckily, there isn't that level of debuff here, so this is really just more so a goal for you to attain, to get a new trendy national spirit, giving you construction speed, dockyard output, just generally nice buffs across the board. I hope you can forgive me if I don't spend too long going over all of the different companies and concerns, organizations that you can build, because there's not too much for me to say. However, there is quite a lot of them. I mean, that's 11 concerns just from industry alone. Further on down, while the army only has 5 companies to work with, the ships, I mean, goodness, it doesn't end, from escort fleets to carriers, task force, battle lines, submarines. Even the Air Force has a tremendous amount to deal with here. Oh, at least the military does have some showing at the end there, with weapons, artillery, automotive, armoured cars. Taking a look at all of those designers really made me want to switch over and look at the military, which is good, because that's what we're talking about now. The Army, the Air Force, and the Navy are all contained within one army tree, which, from a personal preference, is something I always liked. I didn't like it when they did France all those years ago, and they made it so like the Air Force and the Navy bit were just tucked away on the far side of the tree. I like it when it's all kind of very present. This is the military section. Because of that, it should be easier for us to talk about the separate branches, because they're cut off quite easily. But we begin at the top with the Imperial Defense Plan. As we've mentioned before, the Japanese plan was to kind of just win instantly with a fantastic large assault that renders their enemy completely useless. And this focus here at 21 days is kind of replicating that. When Japan declares war on a neighbouring country, or a neighbouring country of a subject, they gain for the first 90 days 10% attack bonus and 10% breakthrough. So taking advantage of that very early aggressive push is going to be kind of vital for determining what the front lines are going to look like for the remainder of the conflict. After that point, things may slow down. If you go after a country with capital ships, you also gain a national spirit, Kantai Kessen, which we also talked, which is mostly about the capital ships attacking each other, which hopefully works on top of the amount of ships in first combat. With that, we shoot off to the left and take the first look at the army tree. Presumably the first focus is going to give us some kind of factories, but after that we're predominantly dealing with the issue that we highlighted in the spirit, where do you want to work around how your tanks are really not up to snuff compared to the Western versions, or do you want to focus on your infantry offensive, working with conscription law, and then pushing for the new doctrines? Note as we push past Bushido, you'll have the choice between Mountaineers, Jungle, strengthening supply lines, and a nuclear project. As the dev diary states here, during World War II, the idea of Bushido, the moral code and lifestyle for samurai, became very prevalent, and with Instill the Spirit of Bushido, you'll rally the army and unlock the grand Banzai Charge tactic. Now, if I don't claim to know every tactic in Hoi 4, but I'm pretty sure there was Banzai Charge in the game for Japan. I think Grand Banzai Charge is new, so I guess a new tactic. Note how it says one of the following: you cannot have more than 0% surrender progress, so definitely make sure you haven't lost any islands at the time you want to take this. Towards the bottom, they say one of the important decisions you'll have to make is whether you're going to pivot towards defensive measures or strengthen the supply lines, which is the difference between attack and defense on core territory or increasing supply efficiency. The question I have is it really so important to have attack and defense on core territory when your core territory is really just on the home islands? I mean, this is about a defensive kind of playstyle, but on an island nation? That seems kind of strange to me, especially when the alternative option, strengthen the supply lines, is just so useful all across the board. I mean, supply is kind of the thing that can destroy most, well, let's not say most, but many campaigns. And considering China is filled to the brim with units, and America, your other adversary, is also going to be building tremendous amounts of units, whether you're attacking or defending, maintaining supply efficiency is going to be useful. Unless Japan has the option to core some of the mainland territory, yeah, maybe less so picking that. Okay, next up we have the central line for the Air Force. I can't seem to pull the image out, but never mind. So, we established the Showa aircraft industry, which presumably would give you some mills to kick off building some planes, before heading down a pretty straightforward open focus tree. Only one mutual exclusivity right in the center, but it doesn't look like we're going to have to choose between planes. The devs themselves say, "Rejoice, all Japan players, for no longer do you have to choose between the Zero or the Yamato. You can now, as the second focus, choose to develop the Zero with the develop new fighters." Rejoice indeed. The focus itself is shown off here with, okay, let's see, ahead of time penalty for half a year and 100% research bonus for light aircraft, a little bit of breakthrough progress, and a variant. I mean, that's useful, don't get me wrong, but 70 days is quite a large token. It's a shame there's no focus in the political tree that would reduce it to 35 days. That was a good mechanic they introduced earlier, so it's a shame it's not prevalent here for what is, if we're being honest, some light rewards for such a long use of time. That's countered, of course, by the aluminium alloy, which is only 35 days, but gives similar amount of breakthrough progress, a scientist, increase in industry, and fighter and carrier agility. So yeah, just an interesting juxtaposition. Heading further into the focus tree, it does seem to be more of the same. I don't think I'm often too critical when I make these videos, but if I'm going to be brutally honest, 70 days for 2 size on some designers and small change buff here, this feels very heavy. Don't we think? 70, 70, 70 all across the board for minor little buffs? I mean, don't get me wrong, having Saburo the Sky Samurai Sakai as an ace is definitely on my list of things I want, but collectively, how many months are you going to be spending just trying to get your air tree up and running when you have to do your industry, the political tree, the army, which is really going to be the core of your pushing power in China? We do at least have a cool flavorful focus on the right in the form of the Z Bomber project, which, along with all of its very familiar looking rewards, has the unlocks air raid on the Statue of Liberty. I can't say as to how useful this is going to be for actually winning you the conflict, but it certainly is flavorful and would look pretty cool. I guess the two things to note really is, wow, intercontinental bomber research? I mean, I guess you really are going to use them, so it makes sense that you would want to have this. It's a shame it's going to take you so long to get it, but it's cool. Maybe if bombing the Statue of Liberty reduced the amount of surrender limit for the United States. Now that would change things. You know what I mean? Because typically, something you see with agencies is people will spend the time to build up an agency to reduce the surrender limit using collaboration governments. If raids could do something similar, where by taking down the Statue of Liberty, they gained a 5% surrender limit debuff for it being destroyed, then I think people would be much more incentivized to go for these very historical raids, because it directly contributes to the time it takes for you to be able to capitulate your enemy. But that's just a little suggestion. I don't know if this is how it's actually applied, it's just me speaking out loud. As of right now, I think most of the wonders in the game just give you like 5% stability, political power gain, 5 war support. Having made it to the bottom of the air focus tree, you can unify the air forces. With it, you get some interesting rewards, maybe a bit peculiar to me. You of course get a very cool ace, the Zero, makes sense considering everything, but you also get, for example, research debuff removed, which I'm just wondering, like, at the time that you could finally get this done, wouldn't you have researched quite a lot of the stuff you need to research anyway? Additionally, you've kind of got that awkwardness that the buff is towards air facility construction speed, when one would hope by the time you've reached the bottom, you would have at least had an air facility. It might make more sense at that point if the buff was something like improving the research speed for the projects, which can be pretty late game, so by the time you finish it, it would make sense for you to get this, not building the facilities in like 1944, when their kind of use has gone now. Sorry if I sound like I'm being a bit too critical, I'm just kind of speaking what my reaction is, and very long focuses that give you research buffs at the end of the focus tree branch feels kind of counterintuitive, but I guess that's just my opinion. Next up, we've got the Navy. Let's take a look. So as is the norm, we can assume we're going to start off by building some dockyards, and we will have the choice further down between battleships, balanced or aircraft carriers. Note the lack of submarine wolf warfare here, not really Japan's style. Further on down, we see some additional focuses, including fixing some flawed designs, which probably should have been done sooner, and also the FGO nuclear project. I keep noting some repeated nuclear focuses in here, which is interesting. Maybe Japan can aspire to become the world's first great nuclear power. There is an achievement, after all, to nuke the US before the US has developed nukes, so this focus tree might help you with that goal. Right at the top of the tree, one of the first focuses is to expand the Navy's technical department, which gives you a nice research bonus for ships, naval engineering, and modifying your advanced weapon projects with surface ship special project speed. Wow, this feels in such contrast to the previous focus, where, sorry, I'm just gonna scroll up slightly, just ignore me. Unifying the Air Force gave you the construction speed for the air facility, but then down here, this focus gives you the research project speed. It almost like feels these should be swapped, shouldn't it? This one should give you construction speed for a naval facility, because it's right at the top when you would most want to build it, and then the one at the bottom would give you the project speed. On the other side, we have Prepare the Southern Fronts, which gives you some airbase, marine technology, a branch specialism, marine doctrine, invasion prep speed, and the ability that when you declare war, you get the Strike South for Southeast Asian states, giving you some invasion speed. This is actually a really good amount of rewards for something that is 70 days. It's a shame so many of the other focuses are 70 days, because this one feels like it has enough in it to really warrant it. I mean, even then, a military high command that gives you +6 special forces cap. Those extra mountaineers, and possibly marines, could really go the extra mile. Heading into the centre, you'll have the opportunity, as we saw, to specialise which way you want to go, between aircraft carriers, battleships, or somewhere in the middle. And as you can expect, things will basically specialise based on that, whether it's between getting the base strike doctrine, fleet in being doctrine, or just two generic ones, somewhere in the middle. I don't know about you, I often feel like sometimes I just go for a balanced approach and try not to overthink it too much, especially considering that submarines and the Air Force will usually destroy all your hopes and dreams. Naval bombers just keep coming and they don't stop coming and they don't stop coming and they don't stop. And the final bit we get on the Navy focus is the Naval Armaments Program, which will change depending on how you chose to specialise. With it, you have the option between 4 production lines of carriers, 2 production lines of both carriers and super battleships, or 4 production lines of Yamato battleships. This is an interesting focus for the ability to just outright give you the production lines straight up. I know it's been done before, but it always makes me think about the decision making between sometimes they want to just give you ships, sometimes they want to give you a decision where you like buy ships for civs, and sometimes they just want to give you a production line and it's up to you to finish the ship. I think something similar happened with Greece in one of their focus trees. I think it's Greece. And lastly, but by no means leastly, we come to talking about the historical political branch for the Japanese focus tree. To give a brief overview, We can see on the left we have 3 subsections dedicated to some foreign affairs, and a central, much larger section dedicated to internal affairs, which has a little sub-branch off to the side down here. As we previously talked about in the dev corners, so I don't know if you've already seen this or not, but I guess we're going over it again, the Japanese tree starts with the Kodaha preparing for an attempted coup d'etat. As a result, how you choose to deal with this situation will determine whether you're going to go down the historical or historical path. Because of this, the introductory conflict is actually a timed event, meaning you won't have to choose your focus tree path immediately at the start of the game. However, after a set period of, it seems, 55 days, you will, and there won't be any time to delay. So you have kind of 50 days to think about it, and then after that you have to lock in, and that is your choice. No more delaying. One could interpret this as kind of forcing the narrative of the game into a certain shape, because it is of course an option, especially when playing as Germany, for you to simply not take focuses to ensure that world tension doesn't spike, and you can kind of glean off a little bit more than you would otherwise be able to. But because of how this works, you will have to make a decision, and going the historical path will set you off down a chain of events. But before we get into talking about what's happening on the mainland, let's talk about its foreign policy branches, the 3 of them, which are shared with the ahistorical Kodaha path. Taking a slightly closer look, we can see we have options going from Manchukuo and going north, so that's basically going to war with Russia and dealing with Mongolia, maybe a cheeky Tanutuva, and then getting the resources from the Vladivostok area. If heading north is a little bit too cold for you, we could head south to more tropical seas, with the ability to take down the Tonkinese bases, occupy Indochina, maybe take Thailand while we're in the region, and strike south, even heading as far as East Timor. There is a very cool little nifty section here dedicated exclusively for Australia, so going for Oceania is an option, and you can hold off the Soviets while you do so. Ultimately, you can see there's the exploit the southern resource area, which is going to be useful, especially if you want to take that industry focus we saw earlier, which specifically required you to have a tremendous amount of resources. On the right, we have the Revisit the 21 Demands, which is focusing primarily on the China region. In this, we see a section about establishing the Mongol military government and the United Autonomous Government, which I see in quite a few mod packs, so it's good that it's got some representation here, but also the main kind of focus towards dealing with China, the East Hebei garrison, and strategic offensives in China, both for the national government, communist China, and even taking down Macau. Lastly, on the right, you'll see some brand new focuses with an expedition to Tibet and some mutually exclusives to do with Bhutan, Nepal, and Afghanistan, so we're really heading west. Taking a look at what some of these focuses do more precisely, Hokushinron has, for 35 days, love to see it nice and short, very simple stuff, just a single unit, some experience, land doctrine, so the introductory focus doesn't seem to be too complicated. At least on Nanshinron though, heading south, you do unlock a raid to do Pearl Harbor, so right at the start of the focus tree, Pearl Harbor can already be seen, and thus you can start planning for it later on. Striking the Southern Road has lots of war goals. We've got the Philippines, Dutch East Indies, British Malaya, and just straight up conquering France. With it, we see some decisions to establish the states of Burma, Free India, the Philippine Republic. The real question is, if you were to gain the war goal on, let's say, France, and conquer Indochina, we can hope that there will be an option to piece them out. I'm not sure if the British would be as accepting as to you taking Malaya. However, I would hope, and I have no expectation, but I would hope, if you were to take the Dutch East Indies very early, right at the start of the game, before Germany had done it too much, I feel like there would be an opportunity for you to peace out with the Netherlands. That doesn't feel like a conflict that they'd want to prolong. Maybe it's too overpowered though. It's just always funny when you take down all of Indonesia and the Netherlands are like, nope, we refuse to peace you out. Never, ever, ever. Earlier, you might have noted I talked about how Japan feels like it's on a semi-forced situation to shape the narrative of the game, and that is really reinforced by this, the Kwantung Army. From the start, because the army is so dominant in the political scene of Japan, really kind of overpowering the civic government, they have a desire to escalate the conflict through Manchuria and into China. Basically, the conflict with China is no longer just a focus, it is going to happen in historical. There is no avoiding it. Because you now have to deal with this ultimatum, you may want to take advantage of some focuses to stretch or squeeze the timeline of when it's going to happen. So as we can see here, ensuring temporary peace with China adds 840 days to the mission, which, that's almost 3 years. 3 extra years to not deal with China? So, it's kind of interesting how the outcome expectation to go against China is locked in, but with this level of delay, is it even really an issue? That is a tremendous amount of time. On the right, with reinforced the east by garrison, you can see that you can also remove things. So if you want to expedite the conquest, that is an option too. But hey, who's to say you have to be exclusively historical in your historical focus tree? We love a good contradiction. And with an expedition to Tibet, why don't you start influencing Tibet to turn them into a Japanese puppet? Which I guess could be a use of your time if you've got basically an additional 3 years to play with. You could start getting Tibet on your side. You could reform the Mongolian Independence Army and try and destabilize Mongolia so they can join you. Note here it also talks about the Republic of Buryatia, which is actually inside of the Soviet Union, so this could also be destabilizing the Soviet Union too. Further on down, the persimmon has ripened is talking about outright declaration on the Soviet Union and claiming its territory, so if you do take it, you can unlock a decision to sign a separate peace with the Soviet Union and gain Siberia from them, which, thank you, goodness knows how much this is needed. I feel like at some point, and I don't know if this would ever happen, but it would be really good to just kind of go through all the focuses in the game and find opportunities where it would just make narrative sense to add in unlocks a decision to sign a separate peace with target nation for the single bit of territory that you wanted from them. It's like a single state can escalate into a global conflict, and you're like, I understand the outcome of the game is to eventually reach a global war, but sometimes the catalysts can be very strange. On the right with Kantukon, you can note that you can unlock a support battalion, the Winter Logistics Company, which probably ensures you maintain supply inside winter territory. Remember, of course, that supply efficiency is noted at -20%, so taking focuses like this, instead of trooping all the way down your army tree, might help alleviate some things. So, meanwhile, back on the mainland, for the more historically astute members watching, you may know that Japan had a tremendous amount of prime ministers come and go. It was something of a revolving door. But the game has chose not to reflect all of them, just a select few that they feel would represent what your country's goals are would be better. The first change is that when Okada steps down and Hirota takes over to sign the military minister's attaché system back into law, as we can see here with the military minister's attaché system. Stability, non-aligned support, some fash too, but mostly an anti-communist prime minister. There he is. From there, you unlock kind of the core early game of the political tree, which begins with a mutually exclusive decision between reprimand or pushing forward with the debate, which will shape the front of the nation between moving away from authoritarianism or moving towards it. Note here the Japan-China-Manchukuo alliance, which is, might I say, like some crazy alternative history, just casually inside of the historical focus tree. So, hey, as I said earlier, who doesn't love a contradiction? Other stuff you might find in here includes building up an agency, thought police, on the left some industry focuses, presumably the research slot, and guide the Zaibatsu, which we noted earlier would be useful for turning some of those pesky 70-day focuses into 30 5-day focuses. At the top then, we get to see more specifically what that mutually exclusive difference was, and it seems like there is some requirements. So Tensions between the civilian government and the military factions have reached a breaking point and the debate has taken place, and at that point you will have to make a decision. Luckily, the focus is only 14 days, so not too much deliberation. In the case of taking the left path, Ogaki becomes the Prime Minister, being a diplomat with democratic diplomacy support, and the civic faction is maybe not as suppressed as it was. Alternatively, you may take the more authoritarian approach, things go downhill, and Hayashi becomes Prime Minister. Experience gain, daily support for unaligned, yeah, that could be the rise of authoritarianism. Additionally, we see how in this early first phase of the political tree, you can start making your faction. So, you can either create the New Order in East Asia, or the Sino-Japanese Anti-Communist Pact, which is, as I said, some tremendous alternative history. A few things to note here is that just by taking the focus to create the New Order in East Asia, once you take this focus, the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere, the faction will get transformed, so that's kind of like an active renaming of the faction. It does make me wonder how they've gone about dealing with things like the United Kingdom when they go alternative history and their faction kind of breaks down. I wonder if they change things there too. As for the more alternative history option, it's interesting that it notes China joins faction. This is kind of just non-negotiable. Surely the China player, assuming that you're playing China, gets this event. They have the option to not join. And it's not just so clear cut as you will join Japan, you will like it. And so, after you have created your faction and settled on your ideological direction, the nation of Japan can really settle in to what its future goals are going to be. And that can be seen by the front two focuses being proposing the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy and the Imperial Rule Assistance Association. As I mentioned earlier, the faction you can make with the East Asian supremacy can be converted into the Great East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, and in doing so, you'll unlock this entire sub-branch dedicated to expanding the faction. Meanwhile, with whatever conquests you're choosing to undertake, you will have to choose who your wartime leadership is really going to be. You can go with the historical Tojo, which you may choose to do, or if the Navy has taken priority in your playthrough, go with Yamamoto instead. There is of course my personal favourite option, which is to completely sidestep the military and have direct rule from the Chrysanthemum Throne. With that, your main 2, maybe 3 goals will be to advance 100 million fireballs, promote Pan-Asianism, and of course create the Eternal Kingdom. For those interested to see what some of those focuses might look like a little bit closer, if you want to form the Great East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere, it does of course create the faction, if you hadn't have done so already, becomes cheaper to liberate and puppet countries, and decisions to establish puppet regimes. You can of course do the East Asian Development Board, which helps you unlock decisions to start industrial projects in your allies. So not just a selfish country, there is options to help allies too. Additionally, you can develop the yen bloc. I guess we have to combat the dollar somehow, which means that people inside your faction can become yen bloc members, giving them consumer goods factory factor, civilian factory bonus speed. I mean, that is generally a good buff to have, and the decisions to integrate the economies of your Asian allies, which makes me wonder, is this kind of like integrating the economies with Germany, which is basically a way to turn allies into puppets? Because if so, that could be useful. As for choosing who your premiership is going to be under the wartime situation, we can see, under the army faction, Tojo is the prime minister, giving a loss of stability, rise in fash but division defense on core territory. If you're feeling more like the navy, your fash leader can be Yamamoto with war support and naval doctrine cost, pretty weak but there may be more hidden inside this focus, or you can go with Hirohito for the vash, which gives stability and war support, ideology drift defense, and maybe some more further down. Some of the final goals you may be wanting to work towards, well, I guess this one isn't a final goal, but if the pressure is really starting to mount, you can take this focus, which should give you some recruitable population factor to really get some last units out there, as well as start fighting core militias, which should mean that, I suppose if you're being navally invaded, or want to stop it, you can just make sure that some militias are there to guard the islands. Alternatively, you could stoke the fire inside the heart of the Japanese with advanced 100 million fireballs, recruitable population factor, recovery rate, division attack and defense, just all out combat. But weekly stability is going to drop, and the spirit will be removed if your general stability drop below 40%. So you will have to take focuses, decisions, whatever you can do to ensure that stability doesn't completely evaporate, otherwise things really are not going well. Under the Hirohito version of the world though, we can see Adshow statism with fun propaganda films. Hopefully this can get some war support, maybe even some stability back on track, and work towards the Eternal Kingdom, which is hopefully the great victory one would want, assuming you aren't going to completely surrender to the Americans. All in all, that wraps up all we learn about the Japanese focus tree this time, and from my initial reaction, it doesn't look too bad. I think if I was going to rank certain parts of it, I think that the industry tree looks solid, not amazing, but not terrible. I think it does the job. I think there could have been room to expand some aspects, but it's not terrible either. I think that the military tree has got a tremendous amount of 70-day focuses that might make it a slog to get through with some questionable rewards, but maybe in playstyle it would work better, and I'd say I'm pretty happy, I'd say ranking highly positive, with the political tree, because it has sub-branches dedicated to separate explorations of conflict, meaning that if you were to play Japan multiple times, you could go, oh, this time I'm going to focus on Russia with a peace with China. This time I'm going to focus on going after Indochina first and then going after China. There's lots of room to explore different ideas, meaning it really allows itself for multiple playthroughs, even though you are slightly railroaded with the war in China, but it doesn't seem to be too hemorrhaging. Ultimately, I see potential, lots of potential to have fun, and we haven't even seen the alternative history. But please, tell me what you think. Do you like the look of the Japanese focus tree? Is there anything you'd like to see differently? I'm sure we'll have more to talk about Japan when we see their ahistorical stuff. But with that, I will say thank you very much for watching. If you like this video, you can of course feel free to like, you can subscribe. I'm sure there's more you could probably do, but goodness knows anymore. With that, I will most likely see you next week for more No Compromise, No Surrender. See you then. Okay, but where was the Mofu Sand focus? Huh? Bye.